Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 4, Verdun. The drama of Verdun may perhaps be opened by the visit of the fortress in July 1915 of a delegation from one of the army commissions of the Chamber. The deputies had been disquieted by the rumors they had heard of the insecurity of the region before which lay the army of the German Crown Prince. The delegation were received by General Dubai, commanding the group of armies of the East, and by the governor of Verdun, General Churchill. General Dubai explained that after the experiences of Liege and Namur, permanent forts were no longer useful. They could be destroyed with certainty by heavy howitzers and were mere shell traps for their garrisons. The only effective defense of Verdun lay in field troops holding an extended line around the fortress. Following these ideas, for which there was much to say, the forts had been dismantled and their coveted guns, garrisons and stores dispersed among the armies. The governor, General Churchill, had the temerity to express a different opinion. He considered that the forts still had a high value and should play an important part in conjunction with the field defenses. General Dubai was so irritated at this intervention of his subordinate and rebuked him in terms of such severity that the commission, on their return to Paris, thought it necessary to appeal to the Minister of War to shield the outspoken governor from punishment and disgrace. In fact, however, after an interval of a few weeks, General Churchill was removed from the governorship of Verdun, and his place was taken by General Herr. At the beginning of February 1916, on the very eve of the attack, the army of which the Verdun troops formed a part was transferred from the command of General Dubai to the center group under General de Langley de Carry. Thus, the responsibility for the neglect to develop to the full the defenses of this area was divided and difficult to trace. In a military sense, Verdun had no exceptional importance either to the French or to the Germans. Its forts were disarmed. It contained no substantial magazines. It guarded no significant strategic point. It was 220 kilometers from Paris, and its capture would not have made any material difference to the safety either of the capital or of the general line. Falkenhayn and Ludendorff both speak of it as a dangerous sally-port against their main railway communications, scarcely 12 miles away. But seeing that only 2 inferior lines of railway served Verdun, while the German-occupied area in its front was fed by no less than 15, it should have been easy for the Germans to provide against such a sally. At its highest, the capture of Verdun would have been a military convenience to the Germans, and in a lesser degree an inconvenience to the French. But then there was the sentiment which attached to Verdun. It was, says a French historian, footnote, Corda in Les Guerres Mondiales, page 187, end of footnote, the great fortress proudly confronting its rival Metz, whose name had for centuries not ceased to haunt Germanic imaginations. It was the great advanced citadel of France, the principal bastion of her eastern frontier, whose fall, resounding throughout Europe and the whole world, would efface forever the victories of the Marne and Yser. This, then, was the foundation upon which Falkenhayn's conception of the German attack upon Verdun stood. It was not to be an attempt at a breakthrough. The assailants were not to be drawn into pockets from which they would be fired at from all sides. They were to fire at the French and assault them continually in positions which French pride would make it impossible to yield. The 19 German divisions and the massed artillery assigned to the task were to wear out and bleed white the French army. Verdun was to become an anvil upon which French military manhood was to be hammered to death by German cannon. The French were to be fastened to fixed positions by sentiment and battered to pieces there by artillery. Of course, this ingenious plan would be frustrated if the French did not lend themselves to it, and if they did not consider themselves bound to make disproportionate sacrifices to retain the particular hills on which stood the empty forts of Verdun. It is not intended to press this argument too far. Verdun was a trophy. The German challenge had to be met by the whole resources of the French army, but ground should have been sacrificed in the conflict as readily as men, with the sole object of exacting the highest price from the enemy at every stage. A greater maneuvering latitude accorded to the defense would have rendered the whole episode far less costly to the French army, and would have robbed the plan of General von Falkenhayn of such reasons as it could muster. But the German commander, wrong in so much else, had rightly gauged the psychology of the French nation. Writing in August 1916, I tried to penetrate and analyze the probable motives which animated the Germans in their attack on Verdun. Footnote: The London Magazine, published in November 1916. End of footnote. Suppose your gap is blasted. What then? Are you going to march to Paris through it? What is to happen if you break the line of an otherwise unbeaten army? Will you really put your head into the hole? No, say main headquarters, we are not so foolish. We are not seeking Verdun, nor are we seeking to blast a hole. Still less do we intend to march through such a hole. Our aim is quite different. We seek to wear down an army, not to make a gap. To break the heart of a nation, not to break a hole in a line. We have selected Verdun because we think the French will consider themselves bound to defend it at all costs, because we can so dispose our cannon around this apex of their front as to pound and batter the vital positions with superior range and superior metal, and force our enemy to expose division after division upon this anvil to our blows. The strategic and psychological conceptions which had led Falkenhayn to select Verdun as the point of the German attack became mingled in the tactical sphere with his impressions derived from the success of the Gorlice-Tarnow attack on Russia in the previous year. There a punch followed by a scoop executed on a moderate front, but backed by a blasting concentration of artillery and gas, had led to a general withdrawal of the Russian line, and the process had been repeated again and again. His plan at Verdun was therefore, by this intense punch on a narrow front with high-class troops and unprecedented cannon fire, to hammer the French on the anvil of fixed positions, and, if successful, to rip their front, as a purely subsidiary development, to the right and left. In pursuance of this idea, he allocated to the Crown Prince nearly 2,000 extra guns, including all the latest types, and masses of shells, but added only 4 army corps to the forces of the 5th German Army holding the line. He prescribed the exact frontage and scope of the attack, and confined it strictly within the limits possible to these modest forces. The French trench line ran in a half-moon salient 5,000 or 6,000 yards around the permanent forts of Verdun. This position was cut in 2 unequal portions by the Meuse River, at this season nearly a kilometer wide. There were therefore the defences of the left bank, the west or the French left, the defences of the right bank, the east or French centre, and farther east and to the French right, the plain of the Woevre and the fortified eastern heights of the Meuse. It was upon the French centre, between the Meuse and the Woevre plain, that the intense punch was to be directed. The German High Command believed that if this center were pieced to a certain depth, the retreat of the two flanks would ensue automatically, or could easily be procured by further pressure. Their tactical studies of the ground before the war had led them to regard the positions of the left bank, unless and until compromised by the retreat of the French center, as exceptionally strong and forbidding. All these conclusions and decisions were duly imparted to the Crown Prince and the Fifth Army Staff, of which General von Knobelsdorff was the chief. The Crown Prince has been harshly judged in the passion and propaganda of the war. He has been represented at once as a fop and as a tyrant, as a callow youth and as a Moloch, as an irresponsible passenger and as a commander guilty of gross and disastrous military errors. None of these contradictory alternatives fit the truth. The German imperial princes in command of armies or groups of armies were held in strong control. The headquarters staff, main and local, decided and regulated everything, and the function of the ill-starred heir apparent was largely to bear the odium of their miscalculations and to receive, during the early years of the war, their ceremonious civilities. Even these civilities became attenuated as the long-drawn conflict deepened. Nevertheless, the Crown Prince had influence. He had with the all-highest the access of a son to a father. He had the right to express a view, to pose a question, to require an answer from any general, however august. He also had a share in the emperor's unique point of view. He was a proprietor. Life, limb, and fortune were risked by all the combatants in the Great War, but the inheritance to the imperial throne, turning so nakedly on the general result, exercised from the first days of the war a sobering and concentrating effect upon a hitherto careless mind. It may also be said that no group of German armies was more consistently successful than his, and that there is evidence that his personal influence, whatever it may have been, was often thrown into the right side of the scales. The Crown Prince did not feel comfortable about the attack at Verdun in 1916. He thought that it would be wiser to finish first with Russia in the east. He had, of course, a long-suppressed eagerness to lead his tried and trusty troops once more to battle against the enemy, etc. But he was disquieted by Falkenhayn's repeated statements that the French army was to be bled white at Verdun, and he felt no conviction that this would only happen to the French. It might even happen to the House of Hohenzollern. Moreover, on the tactical form of the attack, his misgivings were supported, or perhaps inspired, by General von Knobelsdorff and his staff. Their view was that the attack, if made at all, should be made on a broader front, comprising simultaneously both sides of the Meuse, and that large reserves should be at hand from the outset to exploit the advantages in the initial surprise. The Crown Prince sent Knobelsdorff to lay these claims before Falkenhayn. Falkenhayn insisted on his plan. He had framed it in relation to the whole situation as he saw it, and he adhered to the smallest detail. There was to be an anvil. There was to be a punch on a narrow front. There was to be an unparalleled artillery, and only just enough infantry to exploit success. They were to proceed step by step, their way forward being blasted at each stage by cannon. Thus, whether Verdun was taken or not, the French army would be ruined and the French nation sickened of war. It was a simple solution for worldwide problems, but it was Falkenhayn's solution, and he was in supreme control. By his determination and superior authority, Knobelsdorff was soon over-persuaded, and the Crown Prince was thereafter overruled by the military hierarchy in mechanical unanimity. Such are the facts. While the newspapers of the time and in these days many of the histories have dwelt on the vanity and ruthless pride which prompted the heir to the imperial throne to drive the manhood of Germany ceaselessly into the fires of Verdun, the truth is different. The Crown Prince, shocked and stricken by the butchery and opposed to the operation, continuously endeavored to use such influence as he commanded to bring it to a close, and we have Ludendorff's testimony to his expressions of relief and pleasure when that decision was finally taken. The first warning of the unprepared condition of the Verdun defenses reached the French government through an irregular channel. Colonel Drian, deputy for Nancy, commanded a group of chasseur battalions in the advanced lines of Verdun. At the end of November, this officer and member of Parliament came on leave to Paris and requested to be heard by the Army Commission of the Chamber, and on December 1 he exposed to his fellow deputies the lack of organization and general inadequacy of the defenses of the fortress. The commission confirmed the account given by Colonel Drian, and their report was presented by the commission to the Minister of War. The vigilant Gallieni was already possessed of similar statements from other quarters, and on December 16 he wrote to General Joffre. From different sources, he said, came accounts of the organization of the front which showed defects in the state of the defenses at certain points, particularly and notably in the region of the Meurthe, and of Toul and Verdun. The network of trenches was not complete as it was on the greater part of the front. Such a situation, if it were true, ran the risk of presenting grave embarrassment. A rupture by the enemy in such circumstances would involve not only General Joffre's own responsibility, but that of the whole government. Recent experience of the war proved superabundantly that the first lines could be forced, but that the resistance of second lines could arrest even a successful attack. He asked for an assurance that on all the points of the front the organization at least of 2 lines should be designed and developed with all the necessary fortifications, barbed wire, inundations, abatis, etc. The commander-in-chief hastened to reply on December 18 in a letter which holds its place in the records of ruffled officialdom. He asserted in categorical detail that nothing justified the misgivings of the government. He concluded upon the peculiar professional note of which French military potentates have by no means the monopoly. But since these apprehensions are founded upon reports which allege defects in the state of the defenses, I request you to communicate these reports to me and to specify their authors. I cannot be party to soldiers placed under my command, bringing before the government, by channels other than the hierarchic channels, complaints or protests concerning the execution of my orders. Neither does it become me to defend myself against vague imputations, the source of which I do not know. The mere fact that the government encourages communications of this kind, whether from mobilized members of parliament or directly or indirectly from officers serving on the front, is calculated to disturb profoundly the spirit of discipline in the army. The soldiers who write know that the government weighs their advice against that of their chiefs. The authority of these chiefs is prejudiced. The moral of all suffers from this discredit. I could not lend myself to the continuation of this state of things. I require the wholehearted confidence of the government. If the government trusts me, it can neither encourage nor tolerate practices which diminish that moral authority of my office, without which I cannot continue to bear the responsibility. Evidently, Colonel and Deputy Drian, in his trenches before Verdun, was in danger from more quarters than one. It is asserted that General Gallieni had no mind to put up with this sort of thing, and that he framed a rejoinder both commanding and abrupt. But colleagues intervened with soothing processes. The Minister for War was marshalling with much more assent the heads of a broad indictment of the Grand Quartier Général. He was persuaded to reduce this particular incident to modest proportions. At any rate, in the end he signed a soft reply. Joffre and Grand Quartier Général had vindicated their authority. The Ministry for War and the presumptuous and meddling deputies had been put in their places. But there were still the facts to be reckoned with, and the Germans. Evidence continued to accumulate, and gradually a certain misgiving began to mingle with the assurance of Chantilly. Their own officer sent to examine the Verdun defences threw, in discreet terms, doubts upon the confident assertions with which the commander-in-chief had replied to the Minister of War. The troops on the spot and their commanders were convinced they were soon to be attacked. The defences were still unsatisfactory. The parliamentary commissions buzzed incessantly. Finally, on January 20, General de Castelnau, the Major General of the armies and General Joffre's virtual second-in-command and potential successor, immediately on his return from Salonika, visited Verdun in person. He found much to complain of and gave various directions to remedy the neglects. A regiment of engineers was hurried to the scene. The necessary materials for fortification were provided. Communications were improved and work begun. But time was now very short. The German masses were gathering fast. Their enormous magazines swelled each day. Their immense concentration of heavy artillery perfected itself. Quite early in January, the Second Bureau of Intelligence began to indicate Verdun as the point at which a German attack would be delivered. A constant increase of batteries and troops in the region north of Montfaucon and on both sides of the Meuse, the presence of storm divisions near Hattonchâtel, and the arrival of Austrian heavy howitzers were definitely reported. General Dupont, head of the Second Bureau, declared with conviction that Verdun was to be the object of a heavy and immediate attack. The French operations staff, to judge by Pierre Feu's excellent account, footnote, GQG by Jean de Pierrefeu, this officer was employed throughout the war to draft the official communiques of the French headquarters. He had the best opportunities of knowing exactly what took place. He is a writer of extraordinary force and distinction. End of footnote. Seem to have abandoned their skepticism slowly. Certainly there seemed many parts of the French line more attractive to a hostile attack. But by the middle of February, those who doubted that a great German offensive was soon to break upon Verdun were few. The majority of the staff were at last convinced that the hour was near, and all, so we are told, were eager for the day and confident of its results. No one, however, had the least idea what the mechanical force of the onslaught would be. At 4 o'clock in the morning of February 21, the explosion of a 14-inch shell in the Archbishop's Palace at Verdun gave signal of battle, and after a brief but most powerful bombardment, 3 German army corps advanced upon the apex of the French front, their right hand on the Meuse. The troops in the forward positions attacked were, except towards the eastern flank, driven backwards towards the fortress line. The battle was continued on the 22nd and the 23rd. The brave Colonel Durian was killed in the woodlands covering the retreat of his chasseurs. The line was reformed on the ridges near Douaumont. But the German 6-inch artillery, dragged forward by tractors, hurled upon the new position so terrific a firestorm that the French division chiefly concerned collapsed entirely. During the afternoon of the 24th, both the general commanding the Verdun area and the commander of the group of armies in which it lay, Lenglet de Carry, telegraphed to Chantilly, advising an immediate withdrawal to the left bank of the Meuse and the consequent abandonment of the town and fortress of Verdun. General Joffre was by no means disconcerted by these unexpected and untoward events. He preserved throughout that admirable serenity for which he was noted, which no doubt would have equally distinguished him on the flaming crests of Douaumont. He assented on the 22nd to the movement of the 1st and 20th Corps, and to request to Sir Douglas Haig to relieve in the line with British troops the 10th French Army to reinforce Verdun. For the rest he remained in Olympian tranquillity, inspiring by his unaffected calm, regular meals, and peaceful slumbers confidence in all about him. A less detached view was necessarily taken by Castelnau. The Second French Army had been relieved in the line some time before by the increasing British forces. This army was in the best order, rested and trained. Its staff had not been affected by the new French rule obliging every staff officer to do a spell of duty with the fighting troops. Its commander, Pétain, had gained already in the war one of the highest reputations. On the evening of February 24, General de Castelnau presented himself to General Joffre and proposed to move the whole of the Second French Army to Verdun. The commander-in-chief assented to this. At 11 o'clock on the same night, Castelnau, having received further reports of the most serious character, requested by telephone permission to proceed personally to Verdun with plenary powers. Pierrefeu has described the incident which followed. The commander-in-chief was already asleep. Following his almost invariable custom, he had retired to rest at 10 o'clock. The orderly officer on duty declared it impossible to disturb him. At first Castelnau submitted, but a few minutes later a further message from Verdun foreshadowing the immediate evacuation of the whole of the right bank of the Meuse arrived, and on this Castelnau would brook no further obstruction. He went in person to the Villa Poiret, in which the great soldier was reposing. Upon the express order of the Major General, an aide-de-camp took the responsibility of knocking at the formidable double-locked door. The Supreme Chief, after perusing the telegrams, gave at once the authorization for General de Castelnau to proceed with full powers, declared there must be no retreat, and then returned to his rest. Castelnau started forthwith a little after midnight. At Avis, headquarters of Lenglet de Carry, and the center group of armies, he quelled the pessimism that existed, and from there telephoned to Verdun, announcing his impending arrival and calling upon General Herr, on the order of the commander-in-chief, not to yield ground, but to defend it step by step, and warning him that if this order was not executed, the consequences would be most grave for him. By daylight of the 25th, Castelnau reached Verdun and found himself confronted with the tragic scene of confusion and disorder which haunt the immediate rear of a defeated battlefront. All accounts agree that the influence and authority of Castelnau on the 25th reanimated the defense and, for the moment, restored the situation. Wherever he went, decision and order followed him. He reiterated the command at all costs to hold the heights of the Meuse and to stop the enemy on the right bank. The 20th and 1st Army Corps, now arriving on the scene, were thrown into the battle with this intention. While taking these emergency measures, Castelnau had already telegraphed to Pétain, ordering him to take command, not only of the Second French Army, which was now moving, but also of all the troops in the fortified region of Verdun. On the morning of the 26th, Pétain received from Castelnau the direction of the battle, which he continued to conduct, while at the same time mastering the local situation. The neglect of the field and permanent defenses of a fortress which it was decided to defend to the death now bequeathed a cruel legacy to the French troops. In advance of the permanent forts there were neither continuous lines of trenches nor the efficient organization of strong points. Telephone systems and communication trenches were scarce or non-existent. The forts themselves were all empty and dismantled. Even their machine guns and cupolas had been extracted and their flanking batteries disarmed. All these deficiencies had now to be repaired in full conflict and under tremendous fire. Besides the direction of the battle and the organization of his forces and rapidly growing artillery, Pétain took a number of general decisions. 4 successive lines of defense were immediately set in hand. In full accord with the views of the much-chastised General Contenson, Pétain directed the immediate reoccupation and rearming of all the forts. To each he assigned a garrison with 14 days' food and water, and solemn orders never to capitulate. The immense value of the large subterranean galleries of these forts, in which a whole battalion could live in absolute security till the moment of counterattack, was now to be proved. Lastly, the new commander instituted the marvelous system of motor lorries between Verdun and Bar-le-Duc. No less than 3,000 of these passed up and down this road every 24 hours, and conveyed each week during 7 months of conflict an average of 90,000 men and 50,000 tons of material. Along this sacred way, as it was rightly called, no less than 66 divisions of the French army were to pass on their journey to the anvil and the furnace fires. By the end of February, the first German onslaught had been stemmed. Large armies were on both sides grappling with each other round the fortress. Ever-increasing streams of reinforcements and munitions flowed from all France and Germany towards the conflict, and ever-increasing trains of wounded ebbed swiftly from it. It had become a trial of strength and military honor between Germany and France. Blood was up and heads were down. Vain had it been for Falkenhayn to write at Christmas, "Germany will be perfectly free to accelerate or draw out her offensive, to intensify or break it off from time to time as suits her purpose." His own professional and official existence was now engaged. The wine had been drawn, and the cup must be drained. The French and German armies continued accordingly to tear each other to pieces with the utmost fury, and the power of the German artillery inflicted grievous losses, day by day, on the now more numerous French. When the Germans had attacked on February 21, they had, in accordance with Falkenhayn's plan, used only the 3 army corps of their center, and 3 others had stood idle on the 2 flanks. It can scarcely be doubted that, had the whole assaulting force been thrown in at once, the position of the French, already so critical, could not at the outset have been maintained. However, on March 6, the 3 flanking army corps joined in the battle, and a new series of sanguinary engagements were fought during the whole of March and April for the possession, mainly, of the hill called Le Mort-Homme, on the left bank of the Meuse, and for the Côte du Poivre on the right. But the Germans achieved no success comparable to that of their opening. The conditions of the conflict had become more equal. Closely locked and battling in the huge crater fields and under the same steel storm, German and French infantry fell together by scores of thousands. By the end of April, nearly 250,000 French and Germans had been killed or wounded in the fatal area, though influencing in no decisive way the balance of the World War. To the war of slaughter and battles was added that of propaganda and communiques. In this the French had largely the advantage. They did not cease to proclaim day after day the enormous German losses which attended every assault. As the Germans were obviously storming entrenchments and forts, the world at large was prepared to believe that they must be making sacrifices far greater than those of the French. Up till March, says Ludendorff, the impression was that Verdun was a German victory, but thereafter opinion changed. Certainly, during April and May, Allies and neutrals were alike persuaded that Germany had experienced a profound disappointment in her attack on Verdun, and had squandered thereon the flower of her armies. I myself shared the common impression that the German losses must be heavier than those of the French. All accounts, however, showed that the strain upon the French army was enormous. They were compelled to defend all sorts of positions, good, bad, and indifferent, and to fight every inch of the ground with constant counterattacks under a merciless artillery. And it was clear that they were conducting the defense in the most profuse manner. The French, I wrote at the time, suffered more than the defense need suffer by their valiant and obstinate retention of particular positions. Meeting an artillery attack is like catching a cricket ball. Shock is dissipated by drawing back the hands. A little give, a little subtleness, and the violence of impact is vastly reduced. Yet, notwithstanding the obstinate ardor and glorious passion for mastery of the French, the German losses at Verdun greatly exceeded theirs. Footnote: in the London Magazine, written in August, published in November 1916. End of footnote. It is with surprise, which will perhaps be shared by others, that I have learned the true facts. During the defensive phase from February to June, the French army suffered at Verdun the loss of no fewer than 179,000 men, apart from officers, killed, missing, or prisoners, and 263,000 wounded, a frightful total of 442,000. Or with officers, probably 460,000. The Germans, on the other hand, although the attackers used their manpower so much less and their artillery so much more that their loss, including officers, did not exceed 72,000 killed, missing, and prisoners, and 206,000 wounded, a total of 278,000. From the totals of both sides, there should be deducted the usual 1/8 for casualties on other parts of the front where French and Germans faced each other. But this in no way alters the broad fact that the French sacrificed in defending Verdun more than 3 men to every 2 attacking Germans. To this extent, therefore, the tactical and psychological conceptions underlying Falkenhayn's scheme were vindicated. Ever since the opening phase of the struggle of Verdun, the personal position of General Joffre had deteriorated. The neglect to prepare the field defenses of Verdun, the disarming of its forts, the proved want of information of the commander-in-chief and his headquarters staff upon this grave matter, the fact that it had been left to the Parliamentary Commission to raise the alarm, the obstinacy with which this alarm had been received and resented, were facts known throughout government and opposition circles in Paris. The respective parts played by Joffre and Castelnau in the first intense crisis of the Verdun situation were also widely comprehended. In the whole of this episode, little credit could be discovered either for the commander-in-chief or for the gigantic organization of the Grand Quartier Général, sourly described as Chantilly. Consideration of all these facts led General Gallieni to a series of conclusions and resolves. First, he wished to bring Joffre to Paris, from which center he would exercise that general command over all the French armies, whether in France or the Orient, which had been entrusted to him. Secondly, he wished to place General de Castelnau at the head of the armies in France. Thirdly, he proposed to diminish, in certain respects, the undue powers which Chantilly had engrossed to itself, and to restore to the Ministry of War the administrative functions of which it had to a large extent been deprived. Gallieni laid proposals in this sense, though without actually naming Castelnau, before the Council of Ministers on March 7, 1916. France now had the opportunity of securing for her armies and for her allies military leadership in the field of the first order, without at the same time losing any advantage which could be derived from the world prestige of Joffre. The cabinet was greatly alarmed. They feared a political and ministerial crisis, as well as a crisis in the supreme command, all during the height of the great battles raging around Verdun. Briand intervened with dexterous argument, but General Gallieni was resolved. Stricken by an illness which compelled an early and grave operation, he had laid what he considered his testament and the last remaining service he could render France before his colleagues. When his advice was not accepted, he immediately resigned. For several days his resignation was kept a secret. Then it was explained on grounds of health, and the charge of the War Ministry was taken temporarily by the Minister of Marine. Finally, when his resolves were seen to be unshakable, a colorless but inoffensive successor was discovered in the person of General Roques, an intimate friend of Joffre and actually suggested by him. Thus did General Joffre receive a renewed lease of power sufficient to enable him to add to the dearly bought laurels of Verdun the still more costly trophies of the Somme. Gallieni was now to quit the scene forever. Within a fortnight of his resignation he withdrew to a private hospital for an operation, at his age of the greatest danger, but which, if successful, meant a swift restoration of activity and health. From the effects of this operation he expired on May 27. To his memory and record not only his countrymen, but also their allies, who profited by his genius, sagacity and virtue, and might have profited far more, should not fail to do justice. After the disasters of 1915, an earnest effort had been made by the British, French, and Russian governments to concert their action for 1916. No sooner had Briand attained the premiership than he used a phrase which pithily expressed the first great and obvious need of the Allies: unity of front. Unity of front did not mean unity of command. That idea, although it had dawned on many minds, was not yet within the bounds of possibility. Unity of front, or only one front, meant that the whole great circle of fire and steel within which the Allies were gripping the Central Powers should be treated and organized as if it were the line of a single army or a single nation. That everything planned on one part of the front should be related to everything planned on every other part of the front. That instead of a succession of disconnected offensives, a combined and simultaneous effort should be made by the three great allies to overpower and beat down the barriers of hostile resistance. In these broad and sound conceptions, Mr. Asquith, Mr. Lloyd George, Lord Kitchener, Monsieur Briand, General Joffre, General Cadorna, the Tsar, and General Alexeyev, all 4 governments and all 4 general staffs were in full accord. In pursuance and execution of this conception, it had been decided to make a vast combined onslaught upon Germany and Austria, both in the east and in the west, during the summer months. The Russians could not be ready till June, nor the British till July. It was therefore agreed that a waiting policy should as far as possible be followed during the first 6 months of the year, while the Russians were re-equipping and increasing their armies, while the new British armies were perfecting their training, and while enormous masses of shells and guns were being accumulated. To these immense labors all 4 great nations thenceforth committed themselves. It was further agreed that the Russians should endeavor to hold the Germans as far as possible on the northern part of the eastern front, and that the main Russian attack should be launched in Galicia, in the southern theater. At the same time, or in close relation to this, it was decided that a tremendous offensive, exceeding in scale anything ever previously conceived, should be delivered by the British and French, hand in hand, astride of the Somme, à cheval sur la Somme. It was intended to attempt to break through on a front of 70 kilometers. The English to the north of the Somme, on the 25 kilometers from Hebuterne to Maricourt, and the French astride the Somme, but mainly to the south of it, on a 45-kilometer front from Maricourt right down to Lassigny. 2 entire British armies, the 3rd and 4th, under Allenby and Rawlinson, and comprising from 25 to 30 divisions, constituted the British attack, and 3 French armies, the 2nd, the 6th, and the 3rd, comprising 39 divisions, were to be placed under the command of Foch for the French sector. The whole of these 5 armies, aggregating over 1.5 million men and supported by 4,000 or 5,000 guns, were thus to be hurled upon the Germans at a moment when it was hoped they and their Austrian allies would already be heavily and critically engaged on the eastern frontiers. The original scheme for this stupendous battle was outlined in December 1915 at the first conference of the Allied Central Staffs at Chantilly, and its final shape was determined at a second conference on February 14. The ink was hardly dry on these conventions when the cannon of Verdun began to thunder, and the Germans were seen advancing successfully upon the neglected defenses of that fortress. It is certainly arguable that the French would have been wise to have played with the Germans around Verdun, economizing their forces as much as possible, selling ground at a high price in German blood wherever necessary, and endeavoring to lead their enemies into a pocket or other unfavorable position. In this way they might have inflicted upon the Germans very heavy losses without risking much themselves, and as we now know, they would certainly have baffled Falkenhayn's plan of wearing out the French army and beating it to pieces upon the anvil. By the end of June, the Germans might thus have exhausted the greater part of their offensive effort, advancing perhaps a dozen miles over ground of no decisive strategic significance, while all the time the French would have been accumulating gigantic forces for an overwhelming blow upon the Somme. However, the councils, or shall we call them passions, prevailed, and the whole French nation and army hurled itself into the struggle around Verdun. This decision not only wore out the French reserves and consumed the offensive strength of their army, but it greatly diminished the potential weight of the British attack, which was in preparation. Already before the German attack opened, Sir Douglas Haig had taken over an additional sector of the French front, liberating, as we have seen, the Second French Army, which was thus enabled to restore the situation at Verdun. As soon as the Battle of Verdun had begun, Joffre requested Haig to take over a fresh sector, and this was accordingly effected in the early days of March, thus liberating the whole of the 10th French Army. Thus the number of British divisions resting and training for the great battle was at the outset sensibly diminished. As the Verdun conflict prolonged itself and deepened all through March, April and May, the inroads upon the fighting strength and disposable surplus of the French army became increasingly grave. And as July approached, the 39 French divisions of the original scheme had shrunk to an available 18. This greatly diminished the front of the battle and the weight behind the blow. The numbers available were reduced by at least one-third, and the front to be attacked must be contracted from 20 to about 45 kilometers. Whereas in the original conception the main onslaught would have been made by the French, with the British cooperating in great strength as a smaller army, these roles had now been reversed by the force of events. The main effort must be made by the British, and it was the French who would cooperate to the best of their ability in a secondary role. While the eyes of the world were riveted on the soul-stirring frenzy of Verdun, and while the ponderous preparations for the Allied counterstroke on the Somme were being completed, great events were at explosion point in the East. To those who knew that Russia was recovering her strength with every day, with every hour that passed, who knew of the marshalling of her inexhaustible manhood and the ever-multiplying and broadening streams of munitions of war which were flowing towards her, the German attack on Verdun had come with a sense of indescribable relief. Russia had been brought very low in the preceding autumn, before the rearguards of the winter closed down on her torn and depleted line. But mortal injury had been warded off. Her armies had been extricated. Her front was maintained, and now behind it the whole of Russia was laboring to re-equip and reconstitute her power. Few episodes of the Great War are more impressive than the resuscitation, re-equipment, and renewed giant effort of Russia in 1916. It was the last glorious exertion of the Tsar and the Russian people for victory before both were to sink into the abyss of ruin and horror. By the summer of 1916, Russia, who 18 months before had been almost disarmed, who during 1915 had sustained an unbroken series of frightful defeats, had actually managed, by her own efforts and the resources of her allies, to place in the field, organized, armed, and equipped, 60 army corps in place of the 35 with which she had begun the war. The Trans-Siberian Railway had been doubled over a distance of 6,000 kilometers as far east as Lake Baikal. A new railway, 1,400 kilometers long, built through the depth of winter at the cost of unnumbered lives, linked Petrograd with the perennial ice-free waters of the Murman coast. And by both these channels, munitions from the rising factories of Britain, France, and Japan, or procured by British credit from the United States, were pouring into Russia in broadening streams. The domestic production of every form of war material had simultaneously been multiplied manyfold. It was, however, true that the new Russian armies, though more numerous and better supplied with munition than ever before, suffered from one fatal deficiency which no Allied assistance could repair: the lack of educated men who at least could read and write, and of trained officers and sergeants, woefully diminished the effectiveness of her enormous masses. Numbers, brawn, cannon, and shells, the skills of great commanders, the bravery of patriotic troops were to lose 2/3 of their power for want, not of the higher military science, but of board school education. for want of 100,000 human beings capable of thinking for themselves and acting with reasonable efficiency in all the minor and subordinate functions on which every vast organization, most of all the organization of modern war, depends. The mighty limbs of the giant were armed, the conceptions of his brain were clear, his heart was still true, but the nerves which could transform resolve and design into action were but partially developed or non-existent. This defect, irremediable at the time, fatal in its results, in no way detracts from the merit of the marvel of the Russian achievement, which will forever stand as the supreme monument and memorial of the empire founded by Peter the Great. At the beginning of the summer, the Russian front, stretching 1,200 kilometers from the Baltic to the Romanian frontier, was held by three main groups of armies, the whole aggregating upwards of 134 divisions. The northern group under the veteran Kuropatkine, the center group between the Pinsk and the Pripyat under Ewert, the southern group to the south of the Pripyat under Brusilov. Against this array the Central Empires marshaled the German armies of Hindenburg and Ludendorff in the north, and Prince Leopold of Bavaria and General von Linsingen opposite the center and southern center, and the three Austrian armies of the Archduke Frederick in the south. The drain of Verdun and the temptations of the Trentino had drawn or diverted from the Eastern Front both reserves and reinforcements, and practically all the heavy artillery. And in the whole of the sector south of the Pripyat, comprising all Galicia and the Bukovina, not a German division remained to sustain the armies of the Austrian Archduke against the forces of Brusilov. The original scheme had contemplated July 1 as the date of the general Allied attack, both in the west and in the east. But the cries of Italy from the Trentino and the obvious strain under which the French were living at Verdun led to requests being made to the Tsar to intervene, if possible at an earlier date. Accordingly, on June 4, Brusilov, after a 30 hours bombardment, set his armies of over 1 million men in motion and advanced in a general attack on the 350-kilometer front between the Pripyat and the Romanian frontier. The results were equally astounding to victors and vanquished, to friend and foe. It may well be that the very antedating of the attack imparted to it an element of surprise that a month later would have been lacking. Certainly the Austrians were entirely unprepared for the weight, vigor, and enormous extent of the assault. The long loose lines in the east in no way reproduced the conditions of the Western Front. The great concentrations of artillery, the intricate systems of fortifications, the continuous zones of machine gun fire, the network of roads and railways feeding the front and enabling reserves to be thrown in thousands and tens of thousands in a few hours upon any threatened point, were entirely lacking in the east. Moreover, the Austrian armies contained large numbers of Czech troops fighting under duress for the cause they did not cherish and an empire whose downfall they desired. No one was more surprised than Falkenhayn. After the failure, footnote, General Headquarters 1914 to 1916 and its critical decisions, by General von Falkenhayn, pages 244 to 247, end of footnote. He wrote, "Of the March offensive in Lithuania and Courland, the Russian front had remained absolutely inactive. There was no reason whatever to doubt that the front was equal to any attack on it by the forces opposing it at the moment. General Konrad von Hotzendorf declared that a Russian attack in Galicia could not be undertaken with any prospect of success in less than from 4 to 6 weeks, from the time when we should have learned that it was coming. This period at least would be required for the concentration of the Russian forces, which must be a necessary preliminary thereto. However, before any indication of movement of this sort had been noticed, to say nothing of announced, a most urgent call of assistance from our ally reached the German General Headquarters on the 5th of June. The Russians, under the command of General Brusilov, had on the previous day attacked almost the entire front, from the Styr bend near Kolki, below Lutsk, right to the Romanian borders. After a relatively short artillery preparation, they had got up from their trenches and simply marched forward. Only in a few places had they even taken the trouble to form attacking groups by concentrating their reserves. It was a matter not simply of an attack in the true sense of the word, but rather of a big-scale reconnaissance. A reconnaissance like Brusilov's was only possible, of course, if the general had decisive reason for holding a low opinion of his enemy's power of resistance, and on this point he made no miscalculation. His attack met with splendid success, both in Volhynia and in the Bukovina. East of Lutsk, the Austro-Hungarian front was clean broken through, and in less than 2 days a yawning gap fully 30 miles wide had been made in it. The part of the 4th Austro-Hungarian Army, which was in the line here, melted away into miserable remnants. Things went no better with the 7th Austro-Hungarian Army in the Bukovina. It flowed back along its entire front, and it was impossible to judge at the moment whether and when it could be brought to a halt again. We were therefore faced with a situation which had fundamentally changed. A wholesale failure of this kind had certainly not entered into the calculations of the Chief of the General Staff himself. He had considered it impossible. All along the front, the Russian armies marched over the Austrian lines or through wide breaches in them. In the north, the army of Kaledine advanced in 3 days on a 70-kilometer front no less than 50 kilometers, taking Lutsk. In the south, the army of Lechitsky, forcing successively the lines of the Dniester and the Prut, invested Czernowitz after an advance of 60 kilometers. The German front under Linsingen, wherever attacked, maintained itself unbroken or withdrew in good order in consequence of adjacent Austrian retirements. But within a week of the beginning of the offensive, the Austrians had lost 100,000 prisoners, and before the end of the month their losses in killed, wounded, dispersed and prisoners amounted to nearly 750,000 men. Czernowitz and practically the whole of the Bukovina had been reconquered, and the Russian troops again stood on the slopes of the Carpathians. The scale of the victory and the losses of the defeated in men, materiel and territory were the greatest which the war in the East had yet produced. The Austrian offensive on the Trentino was instantly paralyzed, and 8 divisions were recalled and hurried to the shattered eastern front. Although the Battle of Verdun was at its height and Falkenhayn deeply committed to procuring at least a moral decision there, and while he could watch each week the storm clouds gathering denser and darker on the Somme, he found himself forced to withdraw 8 German divisions from France to repair those dikes he had so improvidently neglected in the east, or at any rate to limit the deluge now pouring forward impetuously in so many directions. The Hindenburg-Ludendorff armies, which had successfully sustained the subsidiary attacks delivered by the Russians upon their front, were also called upon to contribute large reinforcements for the south, and an immense German effort was made to close the breaches and re-establish the southern front. By the end of June, the failure of the Austro-German campaign of 1916, which had opened with such high prospects, was apparent. The Trentino offensive was hamstrung. Verdun was, in Ludendorff's words, an open, wasting sore. Footnote: in his War Memories, Volume 1, page 267. End of footnote. And a disaster of the first magnitude had been suffered in that very portion of the Eastern Front which had offered the most fruitful prospects to Teutonic initiative. But this was not the end. The main struggle of the year was about to begin in the West, and Romania, convulsed with excitement at the arrival of victorious Russian armies before her very gates, loomed up black with the menace of impending war.